Hey, everybody. This is the last audio resource you'll have for the REST cohort, the fourth one total overall, and we'll be using it, or discussing, I should say, when we get to our last session together pretty soon. So we've been through a whole lot of talk about Sabbath rest, a variety of ideas, thoughts, and ways of talking about it from Scripture. But the thing on everyone's mind, I would think, at some level is, so how do I do it? What do I actually do with it? And that's what we want to talk about in this one. And so, Scott, where do we start when it comes to the actual practical part?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think it's helpful to think of Sabbath, in a sense, Sabbath keeping. And sometimes we talk about Sabbath keeping or Sabbath observing. I think it's maybe more helpful to talk about Sabbath celebrating. Like, think of it as like celebrating the Sabbath. And when we think of keeping or observing, it's all about like these rules, and okay, how do I make sure I don't break them, as opposed to as we've talked about in the last couple of podcasts, the gift, the invitation to Sabbath is the invitation to receive a gift. And so we engage in that gift simply by celebrating it, right? And by this weekly, in that sense, that weekly celebration. We've talked about this before. We don't really have a category for celebration, especially for weekly celebration. When I think about it, the closest thing I can come up with is like 4th of July. It's like the thing everyone does. Like, we all celebrate, we all kind of stop what we're doing and have a party together. But if as we engage in talking about how we celebrate the weekly Sabbath, there's a couple of overarching principles that I think are helpful to keep in mind. The first, and this is, and we've touched on these, but maybe to bring them back to the forefront of our mind. The first is that the Sabbath is about resting to the glory of God, right? So it's resting, but it's resting to the glory of God. So this is the difference between Sabbath and a day off, right? Just taking a day off. Right? The question is, how can I spend a 24-hour period resting to the glory of God? And related to that is the second kind of overarching principle, which is that, and we've talked about this a lot, but the Sabbath is a blessing, not a burden. It was given to us to be a blessing, not a burden. And so I think I want to always ask myself, are my Sabbath practices, so we're going to talk about kind of how we do this and what it looks like practically, but before we get to that, I want to ask myself, are my Sabbath practices freeing me to worship God, or are they weighing down my soul? Right? Because if we answer in any ways that this is just weighing down my soul, then we've missed something central to the celebration of Sabbath. And so Dan Allender puts it this way: he says, "Many who take the Sabbath seriously and intentionally ruin it with legislation and worrisome fences that protect the Sabbath but destroy its delight." And so we're going to talk about some of those guidelines, some of the practices, but I think we have to be careful at the outset that in getting practical, we don't become so beholden to our guidelines that we destroy its delight.
Okay, so we're going to celebrate Sabbath rest, and we're going to do that in a weekly fashion. Mm-hmm. And so how exactly then do we go about, doing that? What are the things that we want to include? What are the things that we want to abstain from? Mm-hmm. What does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it is helpful, I think, to start with the things that we abstain from, right? If Sabbath is a day of rest, then we should rest from our regular labors. And really the only way to create space for that celebration is the resting from our regular labors. And that means that the kind of work we do Monday through Friday, Monday through Saturday, should be laid aside. So if you, and even just in general, some general principles, like if you work outside Monday through Saturday, you may want to spend some of the Sabbath inside. If you work primarily inside Monday through Saturday, it may be important to spend some of your Sabbath outside, right? If in the same way, if you work with your hands Monday through Saturday, you may want to spend Sabbath engaged with your mind. If you work with your mind Monday through Saturday, you may want to spend Sabbath engaged with your hands. But essentially we're looking to lay aside the both the specific work we do and also the things that are exactly like the work we do, just to different purposes, right? So the Sabbath isn't for your side hustle, right? It's for a day of setting those things aside. I think the activities then that characterize our regular labor should be rested from, and I think it also generally includes things like commerce, so like the regular buying or selling of everyday life. Sabbath isn't for the shopping you can't get to on the other days. It's not for errands. We also, I think, should lay aside the entertainment that characterizes the other days of our week, the regular distractions we indulge in during everyday life. Does that mean that we shouldn't use entertainment at all? Well, no. We're going to talk about. Well, we'll talk about that and navigate it a little bit. But we should be laying aside the practices of our Monday through Friday week in commerce and entertainment, and even in our digital use. And I think this is where like digital fasting on Sabbath is a particularly helpful and important piece in our modern world, where the regular technological tools like our phone, like social media, et cetera, that are just a ubiquitous part of everyday life. We have to find ways to say, okay, this is a day of rest from these regular rhythms.
So it's not so much like those things are like off limits in a rule-based sense. It's more like if you're going to set a day apart, you need to actually set it apart. It can't just be a normal day with less work in it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, it can't just be like an easy day. And that's where, I mean, and we'll talk a little bit about some categories that might help us make those specific decisions. But I think beginning to the beginning principle starts with what we don't do, which is what we don't do is the regular labor and activities of the other 6 days of the week.
Sure. And in a sense, there's probably a better illustration for this. But that's a way of clearing the table so you can set it with good stuff, right?
Exactly.
The point isn't I'm not doing this and that makes it. It's like, okay, so you clear the table of your normal stuff, your normal kind of work routines, errands, the sort of maybe the mundane work of your life. And then what do you set the table with? What do you put there instead?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, the primary thing we fill that with is enjoying, worshiping, and glorying in the Lord. Right. So we want to fill the day with intentional enjoyment, worship, and just glorying in God and Christ. So whatever we do should fill our minds and hearts, or lift our hearts and minds to the Lord in unique ways. Now, and again, we shouldn't be pharisaical about this in the sense that, you know, I'm not going to go on a run because I might stop thinking about God, right? While I'm running. But at the same time, we shouldn't be overly dismissive about it, right? Like, okay, well, I'm not working, so now I'll just do whatever is fun, right? I think we have an opportunity to, as we explore, what does it mean to dedicate a day to worshiping and enjoying God? Honestly, the best tool is just learning from one another, like talking with one another. Like, how do you find enjoyment in God? And trusting and recognizing that learning is going to take time. We don't have we've talked about this before. We don't have a culture or generations and generations of practice where people can go, hey, here's some of the core things that really will connect with you. Like, I think there's a lot of learning that has to go on for us. But it makes me think of Isaiah 58, where the prophet Isaiah is writing, and he encourages, he really calls, and in a bit it's a rebuke, but to us to take our eyes off of the things that we're pursuing for our sake, for our enjoyment, and set our hearts and minds on the Lord. He says, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight. This is right. He says, not call the Sabbath holy. He says, no, but call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable. If you honor it, not going your own way, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord. And I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage from Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. That's Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. And I think that refocusing of the Sabbath on him that Isaiah is saying is needed is something that most of us need most weeks. And so I think an inevitable part of that, a normal part of that, then is also gathering for corporate worship, right? Gathering with the church together. I think one of the things that almost everyone kind of across in a sense, almost all theologians across the Sabbatarian spectrum agree is that a regular weekly part of God's design for rest and enjoyment of him involves corporate worship with our church family, singing worship songs together, praying corporately together, connecting together, hearing God's word preach. These are the core activities for a weekly Sabbath celebration, and they always have been core activities for a weekly Sabbath celebration. And they're one of the things I think that helps us step out of ourselves and our week and our distractions and everything else and refocuses our heart. But I think sometimes we treat our corporate worship like the thing that recenters our heart for an hour and a half. And I think when we think about Sabbath, what God intends for that hour and a half to be is something that resets our hearts and our minds actually for the rest of the day, right? That echoes throughout our day in our Sabbath reflections, in our Sabbath focus.
So in general, it sounds like what you're saying is the way we typically view rest and time off is like candy, and we need to get rid of that so we can make room for, I don't know, steak, like a real meal
for a feast. Not, and I'm afraid people hear that and they're like, yeah, like I view it like candy, but you're telling me it's supposed to be vegetables.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Like, so you're reorienting the idea that a lot of people maybe have coming in that, so rest is just kind of like the candy that gets me through, and you're saying, well, no, there's actually more to be had than that. And Sabbath rest is a kind of, it's a full meal. It's a kind of feasting, but that therefore means it's going to be something that's focused. It's something that's, got an eye towards God and life and richness and depth, and not just sort of time off and, not having to do a bunch of stuff. That being said, in that grand vision of we're looking at God, and we're seeking to enjoy that in a rich way once a week, what activities does that entail? Besides, going to church, how do we do this?
Yeah. I'm afraid that's what most of us, that's the tension most of us feel is we're like, okay, so I can go to church and then I go home and like do what? Like sing more hymns? What do I do? And I think it's most helpful to remember kind of two general principles in the activity. I'm going to be throwing out lots of different principles, but two, as we think about the activities we can do. First, I think, and it's related to this feasting concept, I think we can eat, drink, relax, and worship to the glory of God. So we can engage in all sorts of enjoyable and fulfilling activities to the glory of God. This is not unrelated to Paul's call in 1 Corinthians that whether we eat or drink or whatever we do to the glory of God. But this is rest to the glory of God and relaxation to the glory of God. I hope it sounds amazing. Guy Waters, one author, puts it this way. He says, if we keep the main thing, then the rest of the day should fall into place. Right? If we set aside the work and entertainments that fill Monday through Saturday, if we prioritize public worship and fellowship with God's people, and if our hearts take sincere pleasure in communing with God, then we're in a good position to make God-honoring and biblical decisions about such details as these, end quote. And so essentially what he's saying is, well, if we set aside the regular weekly stuff, and if we center our heart on God and we engage in corporate worship, then come home Sunday afternoon and do what's enjoyable, do what sounds refreshing. Right? Do what sounds relaxing because your heart is ready and prepared to engage in that, not in self-indulgence, but to the glory of God. And so we can eat, drink, relax, and worship to the glory of God. And maybe secondly, we can recreate in ways that are restful, refreshing, and lift our minds to God. This means that there are kind of recreational activities we can engage in, not just because they're fun, but because they're refreshing and lift our hearts and minds to Christ. John Frame puts it this way. He says, quote, much of our ethical thinking in this area, so right, the ethical thinking about what should we do, what shouldn't we do, he says, should be about goals and motives. Right. So it's not about, can I do this? Can I not do this? Right. It's about our goals. Is what am I after in doing this? What's my motive for doing this? To go back to the quote, he says, dance on the Sabbath can be appropriate. I don't know why dance has historically been such a big thing for Christians, Brian, but whether we dance or not dance. But anyways, you can dance on the Sabbath is what this is saying. B.
Oh, and I will.
So I'm sorry. Back to the quote. I've read one sentence of this quote and interrupted it like 4 times. Quote, dance on the Sabbath can be appropriate, but it is possible for people to idolize the dance as an escape from God rather than a tribute to him. The same is true for athletics, meals, naps, and so on. Right. And I think if we're looking at motives, if we're looking at goals, and the question is, am I escaping from God and life? Or am I engaging in this recreation to enjoy God and life? So in that sense, I think recreation isn't inappropriate on the Sabbath. Playing games or sports aren't inappropriate on the Sabbath. But we have to ask the question, does this form of recreation lead me to worship God or distract me from a refreshing meditation on him? As we look at our motives.
Yeah, and there are also complicated situations that come up. Like life doesn't go on pause.
Yeah.
When you decide, well, I'm going to celebrate a Sabbath. And I feel like that's what you get in the Gospels a decent amount when Jesus talks about Sabbath is, I mean, essentially like exceptions or I don't know, how would you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, and this is where, right, this is what the Pharisees missed, was they wanted to make it all about the rules. And then when common sense, in a sense, exceptions came up that they were like, nope, you can't do that. You got to keep the Sabbath. And Jesus is like, wait, you missed the whole point. And there's really 2 kind of exceptions that Jesus, 2 categories of exceptions. I think this was from John Frame that I find really helpful because they just give me these really broad categories to say, oh, if that pops up on a Sabbath, I should do it. I don't need to say like, oh no, I can't. And the 2 categories are acts of necessity and acts of mercy. So first, the acts of necessity. So think about the beginning of Matthew 12, right? It says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath, right? So the Pharisees are rebuking them for just plucking the heads of wheat because they're hungry. Jesus goes on to talk about how, like, don't you know David, when he was hungry and the men with him entered the house of God and ate the bread they weren't supposed to eat, but he's basically saying, and it was okay. Why? Because they were starving, right? Like, yes, that bread isn't normally supposed to be eaten, but it's not a normal time, right? They're starving. They should eat the bread. And in this sense, the Sabbath isn't meant to keep us from doing the things that need to be done on that day. And that necessity, when necessity arises. So, even just some really practical examples, like if a bill is due, and if a bill's due on a Sabbath and you forgot to pay it, then you pay it. Like, it's not a big deal. If you need to pass along an email so that your office doesn't get backed up, like your office is really stressed about this and you need to like jump on your email and send something, then you send it, right? If your tire goes flat, you change it, right? Like the Sabbath doesn't keep us from these acts of necessity. I think common sense should tell us, and Jesus explicitly affirms that the Sabbath isn't meant to keep us from doing acts of necessity when they arise, when that need arises. Again, Frame puts it this way. He says, the necessity here is not a necessity for human survival, right? So sometimes you might want to like place the bar so high. They're like, okay, if I'm going to die, if I don't do this, then I'll do it, but nothing else. He says, no. The necessity is for maintaining the general quality of human life as it exists in our time and culture. And so, honestly, this opens the door wide open to, well, you can do anything on a Sabbath. Like if the need comes up, like you do it, you take care of it. Matt was giving me a hard time because, as he does, because on a Friday, which is the day I celebrated the Sabbath, I got a call from Jose. He was sick and wasn't able to preach, and we had to figure out who was going to preach, and he's like, oh man, like had to figure out work on your Sabbath. And I laughed but this is a perfect example of that. Like it was an act of necessity, right? Like it's a need that popped up. You address it, you do, and then you go back to what you were doing before. Now, if all you do on your Sabbath are acts of necessity, something might need to change, right? There is a kind of exceptional quality to this. This is supposed to be the exception, not what you spend your entire Sabbath doing. That all of a sudden that turns the Sabbath into just another workday. But Jesus is creating this category, saying that don't be so overly strict that you that the Sabbath again becomes a burden, not a blessing. So acts of necessity is one of the categories, and the other category is just acts of mercy. This has to do with Jesus and the rebukes he received for healing on the Sabbath. We read in Luke 6, it says, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, come and stand here. And he rose and stood there, and Jesus said to him, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? And after looking around at them, he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. Again, John Frame, I think, is helpful here. He says, by its very nature, the Sabbath is a time for giving mercy. So Jesus evidently made a definite decision to heal on the Sabbath, regarding it as a particularly appropriate time for such healings. I think this is interesting because in a sense, acts of necessity are kind of an exception. Acts of mercy are actually, I think, even more in line with what the Sabbath is about, which is bringing mercy and blessing to people. It's experiencing the blessing and mercy of God. And so, the Sabbath day is meant to be a day of worship and a day of blessing. And in that sense, when opportunities to bless others, to extend mercy to show mercy to others, that's in line with what we should be engaged in on the Sabbath. And so I think in these two categories of acts of necessity and acts of mercy, we get two big buckets that can help us navigate a lot of those really practical questions as they come up. Oh, should I be doing this today? Now, it takes wisdom. I mean, it's not because those categories are so big, it's not a slam dunk every time a situation comes up. You're like, oh, should I engage in this on the Sabbath? Or should I say, no, I can't do that today because it's my Sabbath. But I think that as we go and as we learn and as we grow and as we draw closer to God, the right decisions for those things become clearer and clearer.
Yeah, that's really interesting because at some level it drives it back to the posture of your heart before what you're doing.
100%.
So Absolutely. You're really like anything can become a necessity if you're kind of self-focused and worried about everything going right.
Yep.
But the whole point of Sabbath rest is to, in a sense, say it's not up to me that everything gets done the way I think it ought to get done exactly, on the timeline that I have. Like at some level, that was the whole point of Sabbath rest for so long was you stop working because God's the one who works for you to some degree, right? You're you're forming yourself into someone who's wise enough to know that you're not the be all end all of what happens in the world.
Yep.
So just having that heart posture allows you to use these categories Jesus gives
Yep.
in a way that doesn't turn your Sabbath into not a Sabbath rest. You
Yep.
know, like, okay, so
And what's really exciting about this is you get to try again every week. Right. So I mean, if you look back on Monday and you're like, oh man, like I engaged in those things, but it really did just kind of steal my Sabbath. Like I'm kind of in this habit of like making everything an act of necessity. Then you try again next week, and then you try again the week after that. You know, like I think we don't have to get so under God's grace. We don't have to get so obsessed with like doing it right. Especially when it's this rhythm of life.
Yeah, it's about reception at some level, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
You're receiving good things from God, and you're trying to put yourself in a position where that actually happens and doesn't get short-circuited by, the candy of, I don't know, binging a TV show or whatever.
Yep.
But simultaneously doesn't get so heavy that you're kind of going, oh, this is about me performing and like getting Sabbath rest right. Like,
Yeah.
that's not really, the point in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
so let's close it down with a somewhat lightning round of, I got a list of practical questions.
Yeah.
Just kind of like to really get it down on the ground as best we can.
Mm-hmm.
One, what if the person listening to this has little kids and says, this sounds great. There's no way it's ever gonna happen for me. Like, in other words, like when you, let's say you don't have a work outside the home, even maybe you're a young parent. You don't feel like you have a day off ever because that's your vocation is raising these kids.
Totally.
I don't know. What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're working outside the home and you have young kids, then I think seeing the Sabbath as a different kind of activity, like it is very different from work. It's worship, and it's worship with your family, and there are ways you can explore how that's engaging in ways that's rejuvenating. I mean, honestly, maybe it's just like being like, oh, on those days, like I actually nap when my kids nap. Like I just take a nap, like and in finding little ways. If your primary vocation is caring for your kids, then I think Sabbath is a unique opportunity for you and your spouse to parent and engage with your kids together. And maybe even finding a different way to engage with them. A different kind of rhythm, giving them, even when they're young, a sense for, oh, wait, Sunday's different. And not just because Sunday morning's different, but Sunday, we do different things. We have a different kind of fun. And the reality is seasons are going to change. And in a fallen world, I think we should expect that Sabbath is going to be sweeter and more accessible in some seasons in life than others. And so if you're in a season in life where you feel like that kind of rest is less accessible, it's kind of a principle of do what you can, and also trust that it's not always going to be like this.
Yeah, it's good. I think that's actually a really helpful principle across the board, not just for people with little kids. That a lot of this is setting a day apart in a way that's real, if not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Like see how you can make that happen. And grow in it as best you can. Plenty of acts of necessity with small kids. Okay, so next one.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people in West LA have varying schedules, but a lot of people have the very typical American schedule. They're Monday through Friday. You get Saturday and Sunday off.
Yeah.
So here are these 2 days off. How do I navigate both those days in light of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So Saturdays, I think, if you think about this as kind of a Saturday and then Sunday as a Sabbath, I don't think this means that you need to, I need to go to work on Saturday, right? Because I really only should have one day. Right? Saturday may be a day off from your normal work, but that doesn't make it a Sabbath. And this even highlights, I think, the difference between a Sabbath and a day off. There will inevitably be other kinds of work to do, right? And you're, in that sense, second day off is a perfect day for that kind of work, for studying, for paying bills, for running errands, for doing the shopping, for yard work, for repair projects, right? I mean, there's lots of work we have to do in our various vocations that aren't necessarily made up of singularly our our primary vocation. And so the question is, how do we make Sabbath? I think one of the ways we make Sabbath a day of rest from all of that is by utilizing the other day off, in a sense, to prepare for Sabbath by doing those other things.
you have 5 days of work, 1 day of maintenance, and 1 day of rest.
Exactly.
Okay, so on the other hand, plenty of people in West LA have varying schedules, and often they work on Sundays, or their employer, assigns them work on Sundays. Maybe every week, maybe it's haphazard. Like, what about that situation?
Yeah. So if your employer doesn't give you Sunday off, I think there's a couple of things here. One is that what we're given ultimately is more than a specific day. It's a pattern. It's the 6-1 pattern. And so I think one thing you can do is to choose a different day of the week to be your Sabbath and to engage in your Sabbath rhythms. And in one sense, it may not be as ideal because we don't have corporate worship in that same way. But I mean, this is what I do as a pastor, right? Sunday is not a day of rest. It's a day where I'm essentially facilitating Sabbath for my family, for our church family. And so I engage in Sabbath rest on a different day of the week, which has its own pros and cons. I think the drawback of missing that corporate worship piece is real. But again, the author Dan Allender puts it this way. He says, it doesn't matter what day you enter the Sabbath. Many who minister in our churches as pastors may celebrate Sabbath on Monday or Friday. He says, the issue is not when or how long, but if a day is at all chosen for delight. And so I think we definitely start there. And then, I was actually just recently reading through Exodus again, and just a week or two ago, and it struck me when God sent Moses to Pharaoh to demand that he release God's people from slavery. He said, Pharaoh responded to him by saying, no, you want me to not have them work. And in Exodus 5, starting with verse 4, it says, but the king of Egypt said to him, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens. And Pharaoh said, behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens. Right? So as this ungodly, in a sense, slave master, this ungodly employer, he's like, no, what I need, what I require is for them to not have rest, but to maximize their output. And I think we resonate with that in some ways, right? From employers, from corporations, from that want to maximize our output, that see rest as waste, or want to give us just enough rest to make us as efficient as possible. But Pharaoh's unwillingness to let God's people rest was, in this sense, it was a characteristic of their slavery. And we may be in a situation, a lot of us actually may be in situations where we're similarly under an unjust boss who demands maybe work or availability 7 days a week, or refuses our request for time for rest and worship. And I just want to tell people that in that situation, it's not sin to not celebrate the Sabbath. If you're in a situation where you can't, then God knows and he understands and he wants to meet you and give you rest in the ways that he can. Wisdom may suggest, and I believe God would desire, that you pursue a different situation if at all possible. I also recognize that sometimes that's not possible, or maybe there are seasons where that's not possible. But I think recognizing both the not ideal nature of working on Sunday and God's grace for us in the midst of it are both important principles there.
So three general situations. The standard work week, you get a day of maintenance and a day of rest. The variable work week, you might need to move around your day of rest or have it on a different day, here and there. And then the very difficult situation of really being in a place where you have no maneuverability in terms of that day, in which case, do your best to see if there's a different situation out there for you, but know that God's grace is there for you throughout.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
we have talked about Sundays consistently.
Yep.
Is that like the day? Is Sunday the day?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I think if given kind of a default, I think we should default to Sundays as our Sabbath day. Here's a few just reasons for it. First of all, just logistical Sabbath dynamics are made a lot easier when your whole family or your whole apartment or everybody you live with is Sabbathing on the same day, right? It's distracting and more difficult when everyone else around you is working and you're like, I'm going to try to Sabbath, right? There's a community and a communal kind of upward spiral that happens when everyone we're living with and around are Sabbathing together and on the same day. Secondly, just logistical Sabbath dynamics are made easier when your entire church family is doing that same thing. So then you're like, hey, let's have Sabbath dinner together. And somebody's like, okay, I'd love to just relax and have a leisurely meal with you because I'm Sabbathing today too, right? It just, again, it spirals upward. And as we've talked about, a key component of Sabbath worship throughout all of history is corporate worship, right? Corporate worship centers our hearts on God. It in itself is a celebration of joy and of our spiritual family. It sets the tone for a day of God-centered rest. And so celebrating Sabbath on the day that we gather for corporate worship, I think makes the most sense. Because the reality is we weren't created to Sabbath alone. This isn't supposed to, as relational beings created in the image of the triune God, we were created to Sabbath together, even if parts of our Sabbath day will be celebrated in isolation as we rest in God. There's a communal part to that, and that's made much more possible when we Sabbath together on Sundays.
All right, so I'm sure people still have a decent amount of questions, and will continue to. Can you give some simple guidelines to help people think through their specific situations? Like they leave this and they're going, okay, how am I gonna do this?
Yeah.
You've given a lot of guidelines so far, and they can keep all those in mind. But like, is there something you'd give them that would go, okay, take these and see how they work themselves out practically?
Yeah. So the first step is the ceasing, right? So ceasing from work, and then if you're gonna ask the question, okay, well, I kind of want to do this on my Sabbath. Like, can I? Like, is that okay for Sabbath? I think the first question is just, is it restful, refreshing, and lift my mind to God? If it's restful, refreshing, and lifts my mind to God, then absolutely, it's a slam dunk. Secondly, I think we can ask the questions, okay, well, is it an act of necessity today? Is it an act of mercy today? And maybe finally, to kind of a fourth question is just, does doing it or not doing it bring a burden instead of a blessing, right? Again, we're after blessing, and if it brings a burden, then like let's pause on it, take a step back. We can revisit it, but we're pursuing those things that are a blessing to our souls.
All right. So last, what tools would you give people like right now to go, okay, they're done with this, and let's say they have a half hour. What kind of tools do you give them to say, here's what I want to give you to go develop this in your own life?
Yeah. So I think step one of developing this in your own life is so we've talked about the heart, we've talked about the importance of that, we talked about the posture towards this. As you prepare to actually celebrate the Sabbath, I think it requires putting pen to paper. It requires actually making some guidelines. Answering the question, what does it mean to cease from regular work? Right? For me, I've put pen to paper. I've said, okay, well, that means no email, no social media. I try really hard to just do no computer usage, to only have necessary phone usage, no buying. And right. So I kind of identify that this is what it looks like to cease in that sense. In those Sabbath guidelines, how will I participate in corporate worship, right? For our family, we talk about both attending a Sunday service and serving at a Sunday service. Both are a part of our Sabbath worship. And then just making a list of what activities are particularly restful, refreshing, and lifts our mind to God. Are those outdoor activities? Are those creative activities? Are those just reading? Is it just taking a nap? Honestly, I've like napping. I don't regularly nap. I don't even regularly nap on my Sabbaths, but the freedom to nap is a fascinating experience that I enjoy when on a Sabbath when I'm like, man, I'm tired. Like, I'm just gonna lay down because it's a Sabbath. Because it's a Sabbath, and it's a beautiful thing. So making those Sabbath guidelines, I think, are a helpful thing. And then secondly, just taking those guidelines and making a Sabbath schedule. It doesn't have to be a really detailed one. Actually, probably shouldn't be a very detailed one. But when does it start? Right? Like, pick a time. Is that bedtime on Saturday night? Is that dinner time on Saturday night? When does it end? 24 hours later, what's the ending point? When will you worship corporately? And then just what time should remain unstructured, where you don't have anything scheduled? Even just a basic, even just knowing when it starts and knowing when it ends is, I think, an important piece. And one thing that I find helpful is not just knowing when it starts and when it ends, but marking when it starts and when it ends. Marking it with a prayer, with a specific prayer. We mark it with a Sabbath prayer and the lighting of a candle. Lighting of a candle has been a traditional Sabbath practice for centuries, and both in lighting the candle, it has its own kind of ceremony to it. Also, in keeping that candle lit throughout the Sabbath, it's a signal, just a mental signal that today's different, right? The candle is lit. Today's different. I mean, almost all candles you buy today are all scented. But it also gives your home a unique scent to Sabbath. Like, Sabbath just smells different. And when that smell is in your house, it's a reminder that it's Sabbath. And I mean, I could even share, it's a real brief prayer we pray. I'll just share it with you. And these are things I can provide with the cohort as well. But we just pray, blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe. You're the author of rest and peace. You've given us the opportunity to work this past week, the privilege of serving you and your kingdom in visible and invisible ways. For the work of our hands and our heart, we thank you. We thank you for the things we did out of duty and the things we did out of delight, for projects, demands, chores, sore muscles, and acts of kindness. For all that was planned and unplanned, Lord, receive it as our gift to you. For all that was left undone because of distraction or laziness, forgive us, Lord Jesus. For all that was left undone because we obeyed the Spirit's leading, we recognize your handiwork and give you praise. And I can't tell you, I mean, it's so simple, but I can't tell you what even just the moment of reflection that provides, looking back on the week, looking forward to the week, and similarly a prayer as we close the Sabbath and enter back into our weeks as well.
All right. Those are great guidelines, or tools, I should say. We've covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Even just in this particular resource. What final thoughts would you give people to maybe try and bring things into a focus, like the way you'd want to leave people in terms of this conversation? I
mean, obviously, after all these conversations, my heart is that you would explore celebrating Sabbath, that you would respond to God's invitation to Sabbath rest by practically engaging in it. And as you do, like, my biggest overall encouragement is if you're exactly right. We've talked about lots of different things, lots of different principles, lots of different things. My overall encouragement would just be to keep it simple. I think just start simple. The more basic you start, I think the more realistic it is. We tend to want to overcomplicate things, and then as soon as they're overcomplicated, the Sabbath becomes a burden, not a blessing. So start simple, and you can build on it over time. Secondly, I think it's helpful it's been helpful for me to see the connections between our various times with God. When I see my daily time in the Word as connected to my weekly day with the Lord, then they feed each other. My Sabbath feeds my time each day with Him. Then my time each day with Him feeds it. It creates this longing for more that I seek to celebrate each week. And I think related to those connections and to keeping it simple, I would encourage you to prepare for the Sabbath. Like, use a part of Saturday, use an hour on Saturday, use half an hour on Saturday just to prepare for it. This is such a foreign rhythm for us. It doesn't just happen. So it does require getting some things ready, like thinking ahead of time, like looking at the next day, to set this, maybe putting an email response on, or like preparing the like it requires some preparation. And so don't assume it's just going to happen. Like, you're just going to show up to Sunday and be like, okay, I'm doing it this Sunday. It does require some preparation. But finally, and we've said it over and over, just remember more than anything that God intends Sabbath to be a blessing, not a burden. Frame says the Sabbath is mercy, not oppression. And if we can remember that, I think we'll be well served as we seek to celebrate it.
That's great. There is one more quote that Scott has on this sheet he prepared for me that he didn't read that I think is really great. So I'm going to read it in closing. It's Dan Allender. I don't know what the context is, honestly, but he's framing, I think, how you ought to think about the Sabbath. He's orienting you to go, what do I do? It's very practical, also very philosophical in its way. It's at the heart. It's also on the fingertips. What would I do for a 24-hour period of time if the only criteria was to pursue my deepest joy? And I think that's a question. That's a quote that I would want to leave with people to go. Everything we've talked about, I think, runs back to that question. It's not like your superficialist joy. It's not like your the thing that you think is going to give you a little bit of time off. Though those are valuable things, and those feelings trace their way down into something deeper. And the deepest joy is only found in God. And so if you had 24 hours to go, I want to pursue my deepest joy in God, and I can set aside other things that tend to cloud that are important things that have their place in my life. But here's this day. What would that be filled with? Keep it simple. Prepare for it. Remember, it's meant to be a blessing, not a burden. That's a beautiful thing to explore. And we hope that you, after listening to this, get the chance to explore that in your own life. And we hope you kind of ponder these things. And we really look forward to discussing them together as a big group in our next session. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you then.